Welcome to Woodworking Fever and More. In today's project, we're going to be taking this white mantle beam and turning it into Alright, so I take the mantle down to the garage, run it with the planer, trying to get it as even as possible, and instead of turning it vertically and running it through the planer, I ended up using the table saw and cutting the edges down, and at the same time I'm squaring it more up using the blade to just cut barely anything off the front of the beam. And then the sides I ended up using just a sander, and those edges I ended up using a belt grinder and going in, and that was the only thing I can think of I could use that it would be fast. Other than that, I would take forever to use it by sandpaper by hand. Here I ended up taking a angle grinder and a wire brush and going through and scuffing it up and trying to get rid of all the soft material. After that, I ended up using some chain and a sledgehammer or a small hammer and did a bunch of indents to make it look rustic and beat up, and then bringing the angle grinder with the wire brush and kind of smoothing it out a little bit better, more even. And then I took it down on the floor on the concrete where there's nothing else flammable, and I ended up using a torch and torch the beam, make sure I have a fire extinguisher close by, and just kept moving the torch so that way it's not sitting on the same spot and catching fire. After that, I ended up using a wire sketch pad, I think they're called, and running it through and getting rid of all of the dust, or not really sure what they're called. And then after that, I ended up finding some 1/16 thickness stainless steel piece of sheet metal. That's the only thing I had, and it's nice and doesn't rust. And I'm trying to match my table and my light that I have in my living room. So I basically it's going to have a steel corners with bolts that look like rivets at the end. Once I figured out the thickness proportional to the beam, I ended up taking it down to my bandsaw, cutting it down to size, and then using a belt grinder attached to my bench, turning it upside down and deburring the piece of stainless steel, and then measuring out the center of the holes so that way they kind of match evenly on both sides. Then I put it in the vise on the drill press and drilled out the holes for the bolts that look like rivets. And then taking one of the bolts that look like rivets, chucking it into my drill, and then using the angle grinder, and I ended up sanding away all the lettering on there so that way it actually looks like a rivet, and then using a little bit of a sandpaper and sanding and smoothing it over. After that, I took those pieces of stainless steel angles that I cut for the corners and bend them on a piece of tubing in my vise so that way I get a nice even corner. Then putting it onto the beam and then starting to drill out the holes so that way I can epoxy the rivets that look like, or bolts that look like rivets. After that, I ended up putting shellac onto the whole beam. I put nice thick layer on there and let it fully dry. While that was drying, I ended up spray painting all with the hardware, and then I took a scotch pad to the beam and started to sand the beam, and not sand fully but take off that very shininess and then buffing it out. And then I took those hardware pieces on the corners and ended up epoxying them. And you see me here spraying it again. That's because I try to fill in all the tiny little gaps once they were installed onto the beam. After that, I ended up taking the beam up to the fireplace, installing it here, And in the background you've seen that I had the shiplap installed. That's because I decided to finally do a little bit more work. When I started this project I wasn't planning on doing that, and that's what I'm doing here. So I ended up filling in all of the grout inside the brick, between the bricks on the fireplace, and then I decided to whitewash it. So I ended up using half of water and half of white paint. After that you see me adding a little bit darker color, more charcoal. That's because when I went up and started to paint it was a little too white, so I wanted a little bit darker color. So that's why you see me add darker paint. And then I went up and started to paint, and when I would get about 2 feet away from where I started paint, I would go back and wipe the excess paint, so that way the brick kind of comes through a little bit, so it's not fully painted. After that I started to do the shiplap. I attached the first piece and then measured out each ends, making sure that I have about 5 inches on either side that would come down bricks for the fireplace. And then I ended up using those pieces on the sides that you see them standing vertical, and drew a line so that way all of the shiplap is going to have an even line up and down, since that's the only thing that I'm going to have at the edges. I'm not going to put another one vertically. I wanted to have lines running only horizontally. And then I found some studs, and I ended up changing my gun out to the air gun instead of the battery powered one. It had a little bit more power. And then finding the studs, and then on the edges where I didn't have studs I would shoot 2 nails at an angle, so that way it has a little bit more grip onto the sides. A little bit dangerous shooting it sideways like that, but if you be careful you should be okay. And then when I moved down I ended up using, I believe it was about 5 inches on the sides there. I ended up just having a bunch of cutoffs, running another line all the way down using that same long piece, and it will fill in. You won't see the line later. I'll have a caulking bead that would kind of run and cover up all the edges. I didn't really measure this part out. I just kind of went ahead and just started to continue from the top down, and I ended up with a small piece on the bottom, which didn't really bother me. After that I ended up sanding it before I patched it, because sometimes when you would nail it a little bit of the MDF would kind of come up, so I ended up sanding it away, patching it and letting it dry, and then I ended up painting it with the roller. It was fairly easy, but I was actually missing the footage. I don't know what happened to it, so here you won't see me paint. I will just put up the clock on there. Here's the mantle for my fireplace. While I was doing the project, while I ripped the beam off this little mantle here, I realized that the whole fireplace needed an upgrade, so I ended up whitewashing the bricks and adding some ship leaf boards onto the top of the fireplace to kind of make it bigger and for it to kind of stand out a little bit more. So thank you for watching, and if you have any comments or questions, please leave them down below, and all the tools and everything that I used is in the description of this video. Thanks for watching.